Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well on this Wednesday afternoon on March 9th. If you are watching on Facebook, I will do my best to see if we have some time toward the end of today's episode to answer a few of your questions. If you have any for our guest, do be sure to either message me if you're a friend or post something in the video notes so that I can see those clearly. Thank you. And thank you for tuning in during the lunch hour if you are watching. And if you are listening or watching at a later time, thank you as always for tuning into Mythic Mission. I want to go ahead and introduce today's episode and most importantly, our guest, and then we'll go ahead with a few announcements, brief announcements, and then get started. So I want to say hello and welcome back to season 2, episode 4 already of Mythic Mission. My name is Professor Michael Jahoski. I'm also a humanities professor, and I'm happy to have another one on the show today. So that's great. We're representing. Today's episode is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, which is my interview with Dr. Jason M. Baxter about his book of the same title, which I'll tell you more about in just a moment, and you're going to be hearing all about today. So let me introduce our guest. Dr. Jason Baxter is an associate professor of fine arts and humanities at Wyoming Catholic College, a speaker, author, and college professor. He writes on the relevance of medieval thought, literature, and art, especially as it relates to medieval mysticism, Dante, and C.S. Lewis. He's the author of The Infinite Beauty of the World, Dante's Encyclopedia and the Names of God, and A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy, which I also just picked up. Learn more about our guest today at his website. I'll have that in the show notes so that you can also procure a signed copy of his book, which you can get through his website. I'll make sure that you have access to that everywhere you listen and watch the show, as well as a link to InterVarsity Press, where you can also purchase the book. That was the publisher for this book today, which again is entitled The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis, How Great Books Shaped a Great Mind. And I want to also thank Krista Clayton and InterVarsity Press for sending an advanced copy of the book, which, by the way, releases on Tuesday, March 15th. You can get it everywhere books are sold in different formats. And I'm also told the audio version is available this week, today, I believe. So
yes, as of yesterday.
As of yesterday, excellent. So go ahead and if you're an Audible member, as I am and many of us are, you can also get it there. And it was, you said Simon Vance who narrates it?
Yes, it's absolutely extraordinary. I was just telling Michael that I would listen to Simon Vance read the phone book. And so to hear him read my book, it just seems like a sort of, I don't know, sublimation of my work as an American with a British reader. It's really quite a treat.
Yeah, excellent. I hope some will pick that up, including myself. Before I begin, let me just ask you to consider joining us on the mission. Our ministry here for Christ and His Kingdom, Mythic Mission, is not behind any paywall. All of these episodes are free. We just hope that you'll support us and advance God's kingdom as we are trying to obviously spread the good news in our own way, as well as providing high quality interviews with scholars and some musings of my own. The way you can do that is go to patreon.com/mythic mission, all one word. And there's a lot of cool perks and merchandise and things you can do to be part of the mission with us, including a newly minted private group on Facebook and some face-to-face Q&As with me once a month. And so once we get that going a little bit more, we'll be doing those more frequently and announcing ways you can interface with me. So we'll hope you'll prayerfully consider that. But the best way you can support us, as always, is just to share that we exist with others and to let them know you can get some of the world's greatest minds talking about some of the great subjects for free. And do take notes today because we've got a lot of really excellent topics for you. So let me go ahead and get started. And thank you, Dr. Baxter, for joining me.
Thank you. Been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So let's just start with, why did you write this book now? And could you speak a little bit to the personal relevance of C.S. Lewis to you?
Yes. I don't think I understood why Lewis was so relevant to me until I wrote the book. I probably, like a lot of your listeners and watchers, I have read Lewis from the time I was a teenager with admiration, both for me, it was actually his nonfiction before his fiction, but loved his sermons and found them. I think I had a response to Lewis, how Lewis describes in Surprised by Joy, his own response to G.K. Chesterton, and in which he, as a young atheist, was surprised that he actually liked Chesterton so much and concluded years later, that he thought it was his holiness. Or he says that about George MacDonald, right? But both MacDonald and Chesterton had this kind of quality of holiness, and I think that's what has attracted me to Lewis. But Lewis provides a particular explanation for this. He oftentimes describes literature as a landscape, or as breathing an atmosphere, or as weather, or as walking through a landscape with what he calls wise passivity. Mm-hmm. I think that's why I've loved him so much, is that he's not just a conceptual writer. He doesn't just give opinions or particular correct ideas, but manages to flesh them out, even in his nonfiction, in literary and rhetorical worlds, such that, as I've been increasingly saying about Lewis, but also about Dante, it's a way in which ideas and truth gets into your veins and pulses. It's an embodiment, a creation of a landscape, creation of a mythic atmosphere. Mm-hmm. That's why I think probably has driven my admiration for him. But it wasn't until I wrote this book that I was actually able to find the vocabulary for this experience that I've had since I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very powerful. And one of the topics that I wanted to ask you about today is one which I share a deep appreciation from Lewis's writings about I think Michael Ward referred to it once as a Donegality. Maybe Lewis himself did, an atmosphere. You have a chapter about breathing the Narnian air, which I love. And that quality, which is a concrete experiential quality we get from myth, is a particularly powerful draw. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I share that affection for that aspect of Lewis's work as well. So, I found it was also a very unique book. By the way, I wanted to hold up the book so people could see it here. Yeah, we've got matching copies. There we go. So I've marked this thing up probably more than most books I've marked up recently. I've got underline and lots of later green highlights in later parts of the book here. I wanted to ask you why you felt it was particularly relevant to writing this book now, because a lot of my students in my classrooms find the medieval world. This will be a segue into our next question too. The medieval worldview, the medieval period, the Middle Ages, just a drag. So why? And that's sad, of course, but why write this book now?
Yeah, I think this is Lewis thought in 1954, when he took this special chair made for him at Cambridge, the chair of medieval and Renaissance studies, or medieval and Renaissance literature, he thought that the old myth, in which we call the Middle Ages the Dark Ages, was finally beginning to crumble. And he's not wrong about very often, or about a lot of things, but on this he was. The myth has survived that that just to conflate the Middle Ages with the Dark Ages, right? I think is kind of says it all. And I say at the beginning of Breathing Narnian Air this: on more than one occasion, Lewis made passing comments about the magical properties of living in Narnia. When the Pevensie children had lived in Narnia long enough that if ever they remembered their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. They spoke in a new high mode of discourse and courtly cadences suited to their occupations. When we read that in fiction, we love it. But we forget that Lewis derived these types of concepts and these types of notions from the Middle Ages. So my hope was to basically use Lewis to introduce lovers of Lewis, and there's so many of them, to a wider circle of friends. Just thinking, you're working on this right now, Michael. Everyone loves to know a little bit more about the Inklings, right? The strange and mysterious Charles Williams, or the brilliant but difficult to read Owen Barfield, and of course Tolkien, and as well as the other sort of minor characters. We love to Humphrey Carpenter's book, right, in which he tries to reconstruct that chapter of what an Inklings meeting felt like, sitting in the back of the bird and the baby, right? It's a delight. It's a delight not just to know Lewis, but to know Lewis's friends, because we know Alan Jacobs has a cool chapter on this in his book. We know how driven by friendship Lewis was. Lewis considered himself sort of Jupiterian in his astrological sign, right? But that he had this kind of warm, affectionate, magnanimous, friend-building, friend-loving personality. what is fun to discover about Lewis is that Lewis didn't exclude the circle of his friends to the merely living, but like Chesterton practicing a democracy of dead, seemingly developed real affection for old Boethius and Virgil and these dead authors, such that I think we could almost think of Lewis's medieval authors, especially Dante, especially Boethius, especially, probably Plato, to a certain extent Aquinas, some of the 17th century Anglican theologians, as extended members of the Inklings that Lewis would have loved to have spent time with, Thomas Traherne, if only they just didn't happen to be dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's I got that sense that, and I recall what you mentioned about Chesterton's Democracy of the Dead, this long chain of heroes, literary, philosophical, theological heroes that Lewis had and the other Inklings had, is kind of an extension of their group. It's a lovely idea. And yes, thank you. I think we can see that the medieval worldview of Lewis is very relevant, and that this perspective hasn't died out. And much like many predictions about the dying out of religion too, I think was wrong, as you said, that this is still with us, and we should take a closer look as to why this is such an important perspective on the world. In fact, in the next unit of my intro classes, I'm doing a bit of a introduction on what we can learn from the medieval perspective of the cosmos and how that can just change the way that we think about all sorts of things. So valuable, very important. And on that note,
sorry, I was just remembering another passage I think your readers might or your listeners might enjoy.
Please.
Is at the beginning of chapter 1, the Lost Cathedral. This is Lewis. In the popular imagination, as Lewis joked more than once, the term Middle Ages evokes a misty blend of knights, castles, witch trials, torture devices, armor, superstitious peasants covered in dirt, and maybe a dragon and princess thrown into boot. Need it be said? That was not how Lewis envisioned the time period. But like you said, I think a period of like incredible intellectual sophistication, which, even though, again, as Lewis talks about in his own sort of meditation on kind of science and theology, even though some of the particular beliefs have been exploded, the approach to the world, that is, in terms of modeling and in terms of thinking about this mythic imagination, are actually shockingly relevant to contemporary philosophy of science discourses.
Let's talk about that. I'd like to ask your opinion on, of course, what you meant, I think, in the introduction by the long Middle Ages, and then to tell us a little bit about Lewis as a medievalist and what exactly is entailed by that. So can we get into some more detail?
Sure.
Great.
I mean, I think, the easiest, definition for Middle Ages would just be that which happens, you could say, after the death of Boethius, but before the invention of the printing press, or something like 500 AD to 1500 AD. Right. But Lewis had a more interesting and more daring and more ambitious definition, which he talks about, again, in this Cambridge address, the De Descriptione Temporum, or on the drawing up of time periods, right? So Lewis thought that despite the differences, he makes some funny and outrageous claims. An Egyptian pharaoh might have had more in common with Jane Austen, who's writing in the early 1800s, than Jane Austen did with someone living in the 1950s. That is, a single century of separation. More had happened, more in terms of advances of not just the creation of machines, but I guess, since then, even we could even talk about more, but the sort of internalization of machines, such that our imaginations are kind of machine-scapes. Our relationships to the world are so mediated, for good or for ill, that this had affected our very imagination, such that we had less in common with Jane Austen than Jane Austen did with an Egyptian pharaoh. So this is the long Middle Ages, from from Babylonian literature like Gilgamesh all the way up to at least the 18th century, but even into the early 19th century. And what Lewis thought that they all had in common was this background belief, this sense that the natural world wasn't just a machine, wasn't just a bunch of inert matter obeying chemical and physical laws, but it had a kind of theological significance to it as well, or to use one of his favorite terms, one of your favorite terms, it had a kind of sacramentalism to it, a kind of iconicity, a type of symbolism to it, that even in its natural operations, it was groaning to express, which sounds like good quotation from the letter to Romans, right? But groaning to express something which was behind it.
Yeah.
And that idea is not only sort of disappeared from our cultural imagination, but it has disappeared so much that it seems absurd, or I don't know, hippie or new age or something to even posit it. That's, I think, what Lewis thought was really behind the long Middle Ages, in which you could accept the iconicity of the natural world.
That's beautiful. It reminds me of something you say later in the book. It's probably second to last chapter or such, but I almost had it. Oh no, here it is, page 113. I think this is How to Pray to a Medieval God. That's chapter 6. You say this idea of something higher behind the lower, and the higher participating in the lower, sacramentalism. And this is a very challenging idea to people today, that the invisible, the spiritual, the immaterial could be, you say here, heavier than matter. That's a foreign idea to most people today. They find that pretty absurd. That isn't stuff like my cup here filled with water, isn't that more solid than the universal cup of cuppiness, if we get into Plato, I guess, right?
Right.
Chairness, I think, was the example I was given in college. Anyway, that's a challenge.
Professors of philosophy are always dragging chairs into their lectures.
I know.
It shows the sort of standard of entertainment that they have.
It is tables, chairs. I think those were the two chief
tables and chairs
images.
are as exciting as a professor of philosophy can get. Yes.
Yeah, we do our best. So I think this kind of gets us into the next topic I'd like to discuss a little bit more. Could we expand a bit on sacramentalism and what is meant by that? Maybe taking up with it the challenge of this notion that that which is invisible is more eternal, it's heavier, it's more substantial. Yeah.
The weight of glory. So I think this is one of the many instances in which Lewis is a little tentative, a little hesitant to hazard his own theoretical explanation. And what he does so much, he sort of clears away the misconceptions. And he just wants us to be able to take a medieval approach to sacramentalism seriously, or at the very least, to put it in highly negative terms. He doesn't want us to merely dismiss it. Right. And so, I mean, you'd love to sit down with him and be one of his buddies, one of the Inklings, and begin to ask him some of the particulars. And for example, in his Narnia, toward the end of the last battle, he talks about, the further up and further in chapter, he talks about coming into the real Narnia, and how there's this real world which stands behind this one, and this one is just a faint glimmer. You'd love to ask him, could you go into the details in that? I mean, in what particular way? And it's not something that I think he's very hesitant, very tentative about it. You remember in The Weight of Glory, right? He sort of half confesses that he feels almost sort of indecent talking about the aches, the eternal aches and wound of the heart. So I think to get him into the particulars, it would be a lot of fun, but not something we can do. But in general, in transposition, his lovely sermon transposition, Lewis, of course, likens that he wants to use the example of a symphony. I have Mahler on my mind, just because it's these huge symphonies. He scores them for sometimes 300-400 different instrumentalists. They're very complicated. In a world before exact recordings, and even to say in a world before records or even gramophones, what do? Well, you have to have a talented musician create a piano version of that, a piano transcription, a piano transposition. If you know the symphony, when someone plays the piano, you can reconstruct the complexity of the higher language of the orchestra in your mind. If you don't, you can't. Right. This is Lewis's, I think, one of his sort of favorite metaphors for how to explain what our ancestors, what the medievals, what the pre-moderns thought about the spiritual world. That it's this higher level language which does its best to express itself in the lower level language of natural phenomena, or quoting Boethius, time is the imitation of eternity. Right. such that this world oftentimes, and this I think connects to his own joy moments, feels saturated, feels super saturated. Sometimes a bright sunny day with family and friends feels more than just the sort of recreational pleasure of it, but it feels that it's as if gesturing is too full, too saturated to be explained by its own natural causes.
Mhm.
Well, Lewis would just come in and say, don't you know what our ancestors said? Of course, time imitates eternity. This own natural world, like Anglo-Saxon, trying to translate a Latin text, right? It's kind of a big funneling process because you have a huge vocabulary trying to get into a small one.
Right.
Is doing the best it can to gesture at that which is behind it. That's something like what Lewis admired so much. And to my knowledge, I'm not exactly sure if he ever, fully embraced the theoretical descriptions of a Plato or of a Plotinus or a Proclus or a Dionysius, the Areopagite. I don't know if that's what he thought he was doing,
Right.
because he thought of himself, as I argue, more like a British Boethius, who was less concerned with making razor sharp distinctions. Most professors like to talk about difference, right?
Yeah.
But Lewis wanted to talk about sameness and unity. And he thought, I think he thought he was imitating Boethius in that way. So just sort of creating a space in which this is maybe more attractive than you thought and more relevant than you thought. I think the key term for that is the transposition and thinking about that gargantuan symphony and all of its complicated orchestration, trying to fit itself into a mere piano key.
I love it.
Or a mere piano set of keys.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an excellent description of sacramentalism. I think gives us those concrete images we can hold in our mind to help us imagine and grasp the more abstract points there, which it's a delight to think about this subject, and I'd love to talk about it more, but there's so many great topics I want to get to today in your book. So I want to move into a related topic. I get the sense from your book and others that, of course, Lewis saw, myth as a sacramental kind of story, and that he loved this particular quality you alluded to earlier about the Narnian air, the atmosphere, the Donegality, or the Londonness of London. I think he says, that sort of je ne sais quoi of where you are. Could we talk about why he loved this idea that may seem kind of trivial to some people? I don't, but could we speak to that atmosphere of the story and why Lewis felt it so important?
Yes, the thing itself.
Yeah.
At one point he says, for me, reading a novel is not about the characters. It's more than that. It's more that for me, a novel or any work of art is primarily a thing, an object, enjoyed for its color, proportions, atmosphere, its flavor, the Odyssey-ishness of the Odyssey, or the lyrishness of King Lear. Yeah, and then just on the next page, I have his great letter to Joan, in which Lewis, what a saint, patiently receiving all these manuscripts from his admirers, reads these stories from these kids, right? And then writes them like little critiques. Walter Hooper says he spent 2 to 3 hours a day responding to these letters. And anyway, so reads this little story and writes this gentle, loving letter back to her and says, look, you do a good job sort of describing the outside of it, but you never describe what he calls the thing itself. If you become a writer, you'll be trying to describe the thing all your life. And lucky if out of dozens of books, 1 or 2 sentences, just for a moment, come near to getting it across. And so I think you're exactly right. The question of the power of literature as achieving or as seeking the thing itself, the lyrishness of Lear, or the Odyssey-ishness of the Odyssey, or that elusive essential quality. That's the brilliance of literature, but of course it's also related to this sacramental imagination. Because in both systems, the particulars, the details, the plots, the descriptions of the characters, right, the descriptions of the objects in their room, in a good writer, are always meant to point in this atmospheric way toward that spiritual quality which is behind it. He's got a cool essay called Christianity and Literature, which you know, of course, in which He says that the difference between a modern writer and an old-fashioned, which is for him a compliment, Christian writer, is the Christian writer is always trying to communicate an eternal virtue, an eternal quality. And he'll just use his story quite contentedly to do that. It doesn't have to be the most original story in the whole universe. He just has to create this magical weather, this magical atmospheric quality of breathing and air, in which that eternal quality can, as I've said earlier, get into the veins and get into the nerves and get into the pulses. He thought that in part the reason that Christianity had been so repulsive to him as a child is because it had this strange air, the strange sterilized medical air, right? The sort of Sunday school reverence in which you learn your 17 opinions and 17 correct ideas. But Lewis thought, right, if you could use that atmospheric creating quality of mythopoeia and render these eternal values breathable, smellable, tasteable, feelable, then you could, in some sense, protect Christianity from becoming an excessively moralistic or excessively dogmatic religion. I think we oftentimes unwittingly and unthinkingly think that Christianity is a philosophy.
Yeah.
That Christianity is a set of correct opinions and a set of moral injunctions. The Cambridge theologian David Ford says that Christianity has for too long done too much of its work in the indicative and imperative moods, by which he means grammatically moods that describe and moods that command. Right. But in ancient languages, as well as in modern Romance languages, there's another mood. There's the subjunctive, that has the quality of the considering the hypothetical, the possible, the mood of aspiration and longing and dreaming and hoping. That used to be an important component of Christian literature. Yeah. And the reason it's so important, I think, to recover that is because Christianity in its essence, the glory of God doesn't, going back to transposition, can't translate itself perfectly into the lower language. Right. Because it's the higher language. Exactly. And thus you need to protect Christianity from thinking that possessing 17 correct opinions is the essence of what it means to be a Christian. Yes. Oh, beautifully put. And this reminds me of two things. You mentioned and I think it was retitled something else, but the kappa element in romance, the whole idea of the kappa element, kappa being the first Greek letter to, was it krypton, the word for mystery? Yeah, the hidden, The hidden, which I think you've also described really beautifully here. And then to your most recent point, it reminds me the idea that we mustn't let Christianity just become a set of propositions. It's first and foremost a myth before it's a fact. The myth became fact. His essay where he says we mustn't be ashamed of the mythical radiance that rests upon our theology. And I think that's right. A good quote to mention here. And I think a lot of Christians are, and they've lost sight of that. And it seems that Lewis did as well. And when it was restored, he was able to see Christianity as a more vibrant thing instead of I like your word, sterile. For a lot of us, that's how it was growing up. Right. You know, you have to strip it of those, what does he say, the Sunday school stained glass associations, which I love that he mentions that. Or as he says, are sort of images of heaven, these fatuous images of heaven, of angels sitting around in white cloaks and strumming on citharas, right? Who wants to go there? No, right. Exactly. I mean, there's no reason there's like a cliche and a trope in contemporary society. I want to go to hell with my friends and surf or something, do something fun. I mean, so in a way, myth protects us from that. Ironically, myth protects us from that excessive literalization. Yeah. And the drying up of our imaginations. And as Lewis says, that in our world, all the negatives have an unfair advantage over the positives. Yeah. That is, we know that heaven doesn't involve chocolate, and we know that heaven doesn't involve marriage, and we know that heaven doesn't involve surfing. Right. And so when you sort of delete all those things, it just seems like a bunch of angels sitting around in white clouds playing, citharas, which sounds awful. Yes, it does. Thus, the opportunity for myth to come back in and create a sense of gravity, a sense of weightiness of the glory, And I suppose I'm anticipating a little bit where our conversation is going to go, but that's why he loved Dante so much.
Yes.
Because he thought Dante created something which, as he said of Tolkien, which
Right.
burned like, how do you say, cut like swords and burned like cold iron.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Had a sense of gravity and weightiness to it. And to be able to do that for heaven, which for almost all of us is so evaporated and dissipated, is a tremendous, tremendous gift.
Yeah, and achievement. I think that Lewis did accomplish. So very, very nice. Okay, before we get to Dante, and I'm looking forward to that, and we may have to skim a few questions. We'll see. I want to be mindful of your time. But I wanted to ask you next, kind of switching gears here, getting away from the imagination, the idea of sacramentalism, to talk a little bit about why Lewis really, I mean, you say he hated cars. I didn't know that. And why he felt the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution kind of ushered in a new period of, a period of new ignorance. And this is chapter 3 of your book. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And I'm drawing it from the title to Lewis's introductory chapter to his 16th century or history of 16th century English literature, excluding drama, in which he's got a delightful title, which he describes the Renaissance as a period of new learning and new ignorance. The new learning, I think, is, kind of obvious for everyone.
Yeah.
It's instruments, right? Telescopes, microscopes, accurate clocks, pendulums, vacuum pumps, spectacles. Optics. It's a new period in which we sort of use instruments and quantitative measurements to make predictions about motion, right? Think, Galileo and Leonardo are obsessed with trajectories, right? Predictions of motions, as well as sort of using our new gathered data from, say, Tycho Brahe's telescope to create new models of the world. We all know that, right? This is sort of thing that we're taught in elementary school. I think Lewis thought that the new ignorance came, well, maybe in two ways. One, by believing humanist propaganda, and two, and this is very, I think this is very much borrowing from Owen Barfield, a forgetfulness of inwardness, forgetting inwardness. That's how Barfield put it. That is, when this is not going to be a perfect analogy, but think about how nowadays we wear, watches which measure our pulse and tell us how we're sleeping, and we measure our popularity by our friends and our likes and I think especially people in the business of promoting, right, online material. How many sales do I get? We become sort of so quantified, so concerned with the externalities and the exteriority, and these kind of quantifiable goods, that it's possible for us to forget a kind of inwardness. And I think you and I, if we, talk to our students about this is the one time I see my Gen Z students sit on the edge of their chair, because they know the difference between their socials and their images and how they sort of project themselves into this virtual space and how they actually feel about themselves, or whether or not they actually have the capacity for intimacy or deep friendship, all things, of course, which they crave. Yeah. But they feel almost sort of ensnared in these kind of projected images. If you could take that, obviously Lewis is not yet living in the great age of social media, but if you could take that sort of idea, Lewis felt it already beginning in the 1500s and 1600s. That is this sort of, and I think, again, I think he's getting this from his best buddy Barfield, right? That is already beginning to move into this aspect of externality in which I forget to ask qualitative questions about inwardness. You can think about this playing out in relationships, of course, right? Yeah. Martin Buber talks about the importance of the I-U relationship, or the prayerful relationship with our relationship to God. And Barfield even has some crazy ideas about a sense of inwardness or participation with other types of creatures. But we tend to think of them as mathematical inert objects sitting in a Cartesian grid, right, which if we apply pressures to them, we're still Newtonians. If we apply pressure to them, we cause them to move and we can predict their motions, thus a loss of inwardness. I think that's what drives Lewis the most and sort of frightens him the most, of, and hence the new ignorance, as well as the belief of humanist propaganda. He cites one example of a student, I think this is in the Cambridge inaugural address, one example of a student who had read loads of medieval poetry And yet when he sat down to an exam, he wrote that Thomas Wyatt was the first one to struggle ashore from the tempestuous seas of the Dark Ages. And Lewis is really puzzled about this. Wait, you've read medieval poetry, right? You've read Roman de la Rose, right? You've read Jean de Meun, you've read Dante, and they're highly artificial, formal, gorgeous, gem-like gardens. How can you describe that as the tempestuous? So I think in some sense, that's another form of new ignorance, the chronological snobbery of us assuming just because, I'm going to anachronize this a little bit, but just because our ancestors didn't have iPhones in their pockets, that they didn't possess a type of depth of wisdom. That's a new ignorance as well. Absolutely. The loss of the sapiential quality of living. For us, right, knowledge is expertise, is being able to predict trends and to know facts. Whereas for our ancestors, they thought there was a heart component. It was wisdom. It was maybe even contemplative in some situations. That's what evaporated when the new learning caused the new ignorance.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. And it reminded me of something you say at the beginning of chapter 3 that Lewis writes. I think it's in Surprised by Joy. He says about cars that it annihilates space.
Yes.
I read that a couple of times and I'm like, what? And then he says it does. And I'm like, yeah, it does. And I cannot stop thinking about it now when I'm in the car and I'm thinking, wow, this might be quite a journey like Frodo took into the old forest, if I weren't actually traveling 55 miles per hour in a vehicle. And, all of that, you lose so much. You lose so much out on observing the world, observing people. We like to talk about people watching. And just with those two words, I started thinking about a lot of different things. And another thing that's been lost. So, well, something that I no longer want to lose touch with, as a great segue, is Dante. And thank you for writing such a beautiful chapter on Dante's Divine Comedy, which I know I'm skipping over one of our questions. If we have time, we'll come back to, but I wanted to make sure that we got to this one. So this is a chapter 5 question. So I said to you, I've not read Dante in years. I'm a little rusty, but this chapter really made me want to go back. So I bought your other book.
Cool.
Introducing Dante. And I've also got Mark Muse's, I think, translation of it that I'm working through currently and kind of just getting through. Getting back into it. I had no idea that Dante loved, that C.S. Lewis, I'm sure Dante would have loved Lewis, but Lewis loved Dante so much.
Yes.
Why? And let's start just there. That's a very broad question, but you say it's a counterspell too. Lewis kind of thought of it that way. So let's talk about that. Yeah.
Yes. Well, the epigram to chapter 5, as you mentioned, Lewis says this extraordinary thing. I think Dante's poetry, the greatest of all poetry I have read. And then he says something really funny and really curious. Yet when it's at its highest pitch of excellence, I hardly feel that Dante has very much to do. Dante's the greatest, but also it was easier for him to write poetry. There is a curious feeling that the great poem is writing itself, that the tiny figure of the poet is merely giving the gentlest guiding touch here and there to energies which for the most part spontaneously group themselves and perform the delicate evolutions which make up the comedy.
Wow.
So I think, the first thing is that's funny, sort of funny backhanded compliment, right? Dante, you're a great poet, but it would have been easy to do it, right? It's like going up to the top of a mountain and touching a stone, which is, already precariously placed on another and it rolls down the hill. That's easy. The difficulty is carrying the stone up, right? That's modernity for Lewis. So I think it already goes back to the first part of our conversation. Mm-hmm. In a sacramental world, as I say, physics is prayer. Understanding the natural, just recording the natural operations has a kind of theological saturated quality. Mm-hmm. If that's the case, and then if Dante is just a B- journalist, but describes that the cosmic image, right? The model, the medieval model, as Lewis calls it, then he's already created. If he's a B- journalist who just does that, he's created an A- poem, right? Just to begin with, precisely because of that sense of sacramentality, that sense of saturatedness that we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. But as Lewis kind of continues to meditate on this, and this is a surprisingly good and interesting scholarly article that Lewis wrote. And he did it in two different in two different versions, but similes in Dante.
Mm.
Lewis goes through the last 11, they're called canti, right? These little 150 line bits of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
He goes through the last 11 canti of Paradiso. And he highlights, just like Professor Jahaski, right? He highlights in green every time that Dante uses a simile. And then he classified them into different types of similes. And he draws some kind of, cool conclusions from this. But the most common type of simile, and this surprises everyone, you're in heaven, right? What type of simile do you use? Music, fire, light, right? Perfume, something lofty, right? No,
Mm-hmm.
but the most common simile are crafts, trades, from everyday life, guilds, dirt under the fingers, right? Straining muscles to achieve something, or cleverness in using tools to accomplish a craft. And meditating on that, Dante said, or Lewis says, aha, that's why I love Dante so much. Because the closer he gets to the ultimate beatific vision, the thing which is more elusive of my rationality and my senses than anything else in the world, the more he uses these heavy, laborious images from the everyday trades, and other things too, but actually in ways that reflect the beginning of his little essay on the atomic bomb, right? Mm-hmm. He says, we shouldn't be huddled together like sheep just waiting to get blown up, but we should be doing concrete, real things, throwing darts and bars with our friends and laughing over pints and bathing the babies and playing tennis and listening to good music and reading good books and doing earthly, concrete, heavy things. So to our surprise as moderns, to Lewis's own surprise, Dante has this grittiness, this textured quality, this embodied weight, the weight of glory, the closer and closer that he gets to the great beatific vision. And in this way, Lewis thought Dante was counterbalancing our world's tendency, which gives the negatives, as we said earlier, gives the negatives all of the advantages over the positives. And that's why he loved Dante so much.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think this is perhaps I misunderstood, but what you mean a few times in your book where you say that language was more concrete and abstract in the Middle Ages, and from even a poet like Dante, is that kind of getting closer to what you meant by that? The idea that language is weightier, but also, it captures more of the thing itself, kind of both at the same time. I wondered if you could speak to that for a minute. I want to make sure I understood you correctly.
Yes. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I love that passage in Lewis, where he talks about how I'm like this, I have to admit. Yeah. I mean, if you say, do you enjoy astrophysics? Are you interested in astronomy, astrophysics? I say, absolutely. Yeah. And then you get me outside, even in Wyoming sky, and say, okay, start pointing out the constellations to me. I think I can get you to the North Star, right? And Lewis says our ancestors would have been shocked by people who proclaim interest in astronomy and astrophysics, but then have no concrete, realistic, practical ability to do anything with it. And nor do they know any of the old tales, right? All so why Cassiopeia? Who's Cassiopeia again? Yeah. Who are the Pleiades, right? We're so, this goes back to the car, right? Yeah. Just as we blaze through space in a car and think that we're experiencing it, but Lewis says that our ancestors would have experienced more in a mile than we experienced in 100. Yeah. Analogously, we think that scientifically, the quantifiable, empirical rules, the laws of science are what's real. Mm-hmm. And this causes us to, in some sense, to turn a blind eye to the concrete embodiedness of objects around us. Yeah. To people as well as sort of, creation. Mm-hmm. For Lewis, he thought that, pre-modernity was the exact opposite, that they had all these trades, they knew something about archery and they knew how to do it. And they knew something about how to shape iron into shoes for horses, right? And they had touched these heavy objects. And what that means is when they talked about lofty ideals like judgment and virtue and chastity and courage and wisdom, that the heaviness of their actual daily embodied life sort of rubbed off on the lightness of these ideals And thus they possessed a kind of weight in the mind, which they don't for us.
Yeah.
We might say, like, oh, it's important to be, to practice prudence. But we won't feel it like a sort of ghostly abstract quality to which I can correspond. I think Lewis wants to say that in some sense, these lofty ideal terms occupied a daily practical value in their lives and felt weighty because they were going from end to end of this spectrum of language.
Yeah. Yeah, that's brilliant. And I have just started reading Barfield for the first time in my life. He is admittedly kind of difficult to wade into, but
It's so hard.
Oh yeah. But from what I understand, this kind of gets close to what he meant by true metaphor. That's what I seem to be understanding, this idea that that's a holistic sort of abstract, concrete experience, that we can kind of taste and know at the same time. And this goes back to, I think, Lewis's theology of myth, even that in a great myth, we have that tasting and knowing simultaneously, rather than experience it as separate, which is our dilemma, right? Is what he says in Myth Became Fact. I'm starting to see a lot of these things kind of collide in Lewis's writings and seeing where they have some relevance elsewhere. So thank you for explaining that. I do also love the idea, going back to Dante, that we expect those certain luminous images and kind of stereotypical images of heaven, and instead Dante gives us something we do not expect, and really adds a sort of taste of heaven that we were not accustomed to getting, which is great.
Yes.
And I want to encourage anybody who picks up your book to pay very careful attention to this chapter, especially pages 92 and 3, where you go through all of the similes, all of the images that are just stacked up. And one of my favorite passages here, I want to see if I get it on page 94. You say that toward the end of Paradiso, for example, there's one scene in particular, is it the Canti 30 and 31?
Yes.
That illustrates the medieval poet's delight in stacking up image upon image, creating, I love this, a kaleidoscopic poetry that gives a dizzying sensation of exhilaration. That, from the little I remember of Dante, sadly, that's going to change. It seems correct to me. It just fits. There's no need to rephrase it.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's just great. So I hope people will benefit from that. I know we have a lot of Dante fans that listen in. So
it's funny. It's funny, not that we would need to turn this into a Dante conversation, even though I can point out, you can see in my background, there's my statue of Lewis and there's my statue of Dante. So we're kind of going from end to end.
Yes.
But I mean, it is funny that with Dante, in some sense, Dante gets his practice at trying to describe ineffable realities, transpositional realities, we could call them, right? That higher language, trying to use my lower language. Dante gets his practice by writing about love, writing about the experience of the love of a man and a woman. And everyone knows the sort of sensation of sort of like, initially falling in love and trying to describe what it's like. And you find yourself saying really strange things, but also contradictory, in order to indicate the intensity of it. You might say something like it's like a cold fire, or like a good sickness, or a dizziness which is pleasant, or something like that. But you find yourself image stacking, as I use the term, right?
Yeah.
Stacking up metaphors, but also using them kaleidoscopically, as if I stop on a single metaphor, people say, that's what love is like. Perhaps I don't want it. And you say, no, it's more like this. It's more like this. It's more like this. It's more like this. Right. And we have this sort of desperate chase to touch this thing in itself, to touch this essence, to touch this lovishness, right? And thus we have to use this kaleidoscopic imagery to try to get at it.
Right.
So in my reading, Dante, the love poet, the young love poet in his 20s, becomes Dante, the sagacious, theological poet in his 40s. But in some sense, there's a beautiful sort of continuity throughout that. And if you think about our own Lewis, who begins his career writing the allegory of love, about this period of writing, and increasingly moves towards these sort of theological and miracles and kind of heavy epistemological meditations on the nature of God's relationship to the world. Lewis himself follows an exact trajectory that his own Dante did.
Yeah, that's amazing. This just reminded me of something that slipped my mind. Oh gosh, it's Dante related. I'm gonna move on to the next topic. I'm sure it'll pop back up. I can't speak. Let's move on to the penultimate topic here. I wanted to ask you about Lucy from the Chronicles of Narnia. I loved how you classified her as a mystic. Could you just speak for a few minutes on Lewis's understanding of mysticism, because that's sometimes a naughty word for some Christians, and kind of smacks of New Age. I don't think that's quite right. And I think Lewis seems to capture what I've always felt intuitively. And you put into words some things that I've been struggling with myself. Could we speak to that? And then how is Lucy Pevensey kind of a mystic in the Chronicles of Narnia?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, this was the one question I was the most afraid of.
Oh, no.
And so I'm going to have recourse to my own book, An Introduction to Christian Mysticism. It's funny, I've written a book on the subject, but when people just ask me a simple question, what is mysticism? I always freeze, but maybe that's a good response.
I think so.
Here's what I say in that book, and your readers will be able to hear echoes of this in the Lewis book. Mysticism is founded on the belief that every soul is made with an infinite desire that only an infinite bliss can satisfy. Mysticism believes that this infinite fountain for which our souls thirst is God, but God cannot be contained within the creation he made, nor can he be comprehended fully within human language and rationality by which we represent that creation in our minds. Thus, mysticism is an ascent through rationality toward the edge of language, and when we have arrived at the periphery of language, we walk over the edge and fall into the darkness of unknowing, as Dionysius calls it, which is not ignorance, but a way of knowing that is higher and deeper than our customary rational consciousness. In other words, mysticism is made up of a learned ignorance, as Nicholas of Cusa calls it.
Wow.
If that's mysticism, in my read, Lucy is a mystic. Because she's restless, she's vigilant. She can't sleep at night when all the other children, not to their fault, are comfortable with just being good children and obeying the commands of Aslan, but not Lucy. She's hungry, she's vigilant, she's restless, she wants more. There's a good restlessness and there's a bad restlessness, but I think this is a kind of holy restlessness, an Augustinian restlessness, right? My hearts are restless until they rest in you. She's not content with mere goodness of external qualities, but wants to know the glory of Aslan intimately in the depth of her heart, and nothing else will satisfy. That's why I read Lucy as a mystic.
Yeah, and I think you comment, wow, that's the apophatic quality, right? The wordlessness, the speechlessness of mysticism.
That's right. That apophatic quality, which we get a taste of even in our ordinary lives, right? In loves of marriage and romance, but also in loves with our own children, right? You have that sort of moment where the 4-year-old's sitting on your lap and you're reading Beatrix Potter or whatever, right? And you just want to hug that kid with all you've got. What are you after there? You're after a kind of intimacy which is elusive of language, but now projected that to the spiritual plane. Augustine in Confessions used an amazing metaphor for it. He says, we want to nurse. It's our spiritual infant that wants to be at the breast of divinity, drawing in its nourishment in this way which we hardly have language to describe. And this is funny because Augustine's a professional, professor of rhetoric. Right. So here's the professor of rhetoric teaching people that the most eloquent thing in the world is a nursing infant.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say earlier. Now this kind of ties up Lucy and Dante, but the idea you've been kind of talking about here, the piling up of images and the inescapability of or inevitability of metaphorical language that we all have to resort to, especially when talking about the divine. Whether we're talking about it as the lion Aslan or Christ himself, that we cannot state God apart from metaphor. It seems like that's the best way of groping towards him and understanding him, but it also reveals how dependent we are on him for his revelation and our inability to know things in themselves, without his help. And I love that. And I think it's a clue in our own language, the nature of our own language that people overlook all the time.
And I think that, and that's related to one of the things that you mentioned to me in the list of questions,
Yeah.
right? Why is Lewis kind of constantly warning people off of mysticism, even though, as I argue, and David Downing has argued, it's kind of his spiritual DNA.
Yeah.
Lewis is Lucy.
Yeah.
Those are the kind of deep hungers that he has, right?
Yes.
And if you look just at the very end of Four Loves, right, talking about love for God, there's a glorious paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
But then Lewis kind of sweats it away really quickly and wants to go back. I think it's in part because he's worried about these, us thinking about God as some sort of like spiritual black hole, right? Or the force in the universe, right? Which doesn't make any demands. But the reality is Christianity is complicated.
Yeah.
And that elusive God who's beyond my language also decided to be born as a tiny infant and be held in the arms of human parents.
Yep.
So I think for Lewis, it's very important in our efforts to recover the transcendent majesty of God, not to overcompensate and forget the positive aspects. You remember those funny moments, right, in which doubters are sometimes brushed with the whiskers of Aslan, right? Mm-hmm. They want to talk about, right, the majesty of Aslan. He must be a great king. Yeah. But then all of a sudden there's Aslan in the concrete flesh pursuing him in particular. Yep. I think that's in part why Lewis feels he has to create a safeguard around mysticism. Yeah. Because the negatives can never be taken exclusively without, in Christianity, this extraordinary positive quality.
Yeah, it's at its heart is a paradox, and many paradoxes flowing outwards from the incarnation, I think, and that's what makes wrestling with Christianity difficult but rewarding, deeply rewarding. And, yes. And speaking of that, as we round out an interview that I wish we could continue much longer. We'll have to have you back on the show and maybe focus on a few of these. But we've tasted quite a few chapters out of Dr. Baxter's book here, but there's nothing like picking it up for yourself. I want to remind you all again, you can get it on his website. It'll be in the show notes. You can get a signed copy that he's kind enough to send to you. So please look into doing that. Before we conclude, though, could you tell us a little bit about your conclusion in your book? Because I enjoyed what you meant, and well, I think I understood what you meant by nostalgia for the future. And I'd like to finish on that because I thought that was a very powerful way to end your book. So what do you mean by this? I guess also, what is Lewis kind of getting at here? Because that's what you say that he kind of had, if I understood you correctly.
Right. Yeah. I mean, something again that, is seeming the Inklings had these conversations among themselves. And of course, they all love old books. Tolkien loved even older books than Lewis did, right? Lewis's books look all modern and progressive in contrast to Tolkien's books. But they all felt that antiquity, and this is especially when you read it in its strange, original, difficult language, they all felt that ancient text had a sense of draw, had a sense of eternity resting on them, sort of, covered in gold and dust, and they loved that quality. But as Tolkien began to put it to himself, it's not so much their antiquity, but it's a kind of like antiquity. It's something which is older than old age, something which is older than antiquity, something which is underneath, trying to express itself. But the ancients were closer to it, but not necessarily because they were older. Right. If that's the sort of quality which exists in presence, but best express itself in antiquity, it's not really in time, though. That's what I was trying to get at with this sort of nostalgia for the future. Yeah. I think it's kind of, a way of trying to address this interesting question of, if these things were not factually or scientifically true, why do we read them? Mm-hmm. Well, we read them because they, in their own way, metaphorically, mythologically, symbolically, iconically, were trying to touch this antiquity which is older than antiquity. Right, this beauty, as Augustine puts it, which is ever ancient, ever new. And that in that way, even though the old text, might have been encumbered with some literal or scientific mistakes, nevertheless, what they felt behind all of it will ultimately be revealed in future glory, as Tolkien puts it, in a moment of revelation, which will be so great, we can only call it a eucatastrophe, a great catastrophe, a catastrophe of benevolence, a catastrophe of mercy, right? A catastrophe of glory. And that is what they all hungered for in their old text, but you could think about it as in my paradoxical phrase, nostalgia for the future.
Yeah. Thank you. That's something I hope all of us learn to get in touch with. I think it's a hunger that exists within all of us, but needs to often be stirred and awakened by great literature. And we've just touched the tip of the iceberg of that topic. I hope to have you back on the show to do more of that in the future.
It'd be fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for talking to us about your book. I'll have more information on this and where you can get it, among other facts in the show notes. So thank you, Dr. Baxter, for joining me today.
It's been a delight. Thanks so much for the invitation.
We'll see you next time on The Mission, folks. Thank you for listening and watching.